Burr Heneman, welcome to the new school.
Great. Be back.
In 1975, you and I started this thing.
Hardly a man is now alive. Right. Right.
And we're fortunate that we have our friend and colleague Mary Callender here, who has been working on the collective memoir of Commonweal with both fortitude and grace for, what, about 5 years?
Many years. Many years.
We actually have a tremendous amount of material that is getting close to completion, and I've been the roadblock in that I haven't been able to focus on its completion. So I, on the one hand, apologize for that, and on the other hand, hope truly that we get through much of it, if not all of it, in the coming year, because the time has truly come before memory and mortality get in our way. So,
And it was a great help in reviewing that before today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Burr, I suppose I should start just chronologically. I don't know the date in 1975, but I was walking on the Bolinas Mesa on Poplar Road, and I looked out at this piece of land that housed the RCA antenna farm, as it's known locally, a radio communications center from which communications with Hawaii and the Far East began. And I did have a vision of this site being a healing center. And the vision was that the phrase that came to me as I stood looking at it was that it would be a place for healing ourselves and healing the earth. And the moment was quite cinematic because there were these low, wispy clouds of fog kind of blowing in off the ocean at the, almost ground level or maybe 10 feet up. And then above them was another bank of clouds, and the sun was kind of playing in and out of these clouds. So when I was looking, what struck me was that this shaft of light literally fell on this building, And I looked at it and I thought, oh my goodness. And I had this vision of, a center for healing ourselves and healing the earth. So the backstory, briefly, was that in 1972, I was a young assistant professor at Yale teaching psychology and politics, and I was sort of the hippie assistant professor who taught the course on the counterculture and that kind of thing, and also taught contemporary and classical political philosophy. And in 72, I took a sabbatical working with the Carnegie Council on Children, run by my mentor, Kenneth Keniston at Yale, to come out here looking at how kids were growing up in the United States. And I took a volunteer position at the Bolinas Public School in a second grade classroom run by a Texas teacher named George Bailey. And I was helping in the second, third grade classroom, and also helping clean up the motorcycle shop at the school, which was run by Dave Duffin, who was a very extraordinary man who, over many years, helped a lot of young boys, characteristically, many with learning disabilities, to find a way of functioning by focusing on fixing bicycles and motorcycles. So my introduction...
And riding them.
And riding them, right.
Fast loud around town.
Right. So my introduction to Bolinas was my girlfriend and first wife, Leslie Akoka, and I rented a house from Tom D'Onofrio on the Mesa, and I had this job at the Bolinas School. While I was there, I met Carolyn Brown, who was the on the board, and she was the divorced wife of an Episcopal minister. He had previously been the minister at Princeton. I don't know, Princeton University or Princeton the town. I think Princeton University. They had divorced, and she was single parenting 3 young children, Ambelinas, on a house on Elm Road. And so George introduced me to her, George Bailey, and she told me that she had started a school for children with learning and behavior disorders called The Growing Mind in Berkeley, in an old factory in Berkeley, and asked if I'd like to go see it. So I went over to Berkeley to see this school, and she introduced me to a little girl who had been diagnosed retarded until an elderly Hungarian psychotherapist named Magdalena Pallas took her off wheat and dairy. And this little girl swam up out of this apparent retardation, and she was learning disabled, but she was clearly not retarded. Well, I had studied child psychology at Harvard and Yale, extensively at Yale. Harvard as an undergraduate, Yale as a graduate student and a young assistant professor. I'd worked at the Yale Psychiatric Institute and studied it a lot. And no one had ever mentioned to me that diet could affect consciousness. So this was a transformative moment. So what happened in I came out in 72. What happened in 73, after I had met Carolyn, met this little girl, is that I resigned from a tenure track teaching position. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was clear that that was the track at Yale to start a residential treatment center called Full Circle in Dogtown for delinquent kids. We built it from the ground up in an orchard. We tore down a barn in the Point Reyes seashore and trucked the materials down, and, Rod Freeburn Smith and his wife Janet designed it. And with Tim Tabernick and David McCorkle, and Tim followed me as the executive director, we built this, 5,000 square foot building and started bringing these kids out of juvenile halls in to give them a good diet and, do this kind of work with them. So that was starting in, I'm pretty sure, 73. So over the next 2 years, we built the school. We began bringing the kids in, and it ran for 30 years and did a lot of good work. But I began to feel that I wasn't cut out to do this for the rest of my life. And the other thing was that in building Full Circle, I had written a report for the Ford Foundation, which was one of the first funders, called Tomorrow's Children, the Role of Nutrition in the Learning and Behavior Disorders of Children. And I had traveled all over the country looking at people who were doing this kind of work with children. Ben Feingold and his Diet for Hyperactive Kids, Theron Randolph and Clinical Ecology, Dr. Pfeiffer at Princeton, New Jersey, who was treating schizophrenics with nutritional supplementation. And so I had the first experience of using my reportorial background as a basis for exploring integrative therapies, which was going to be the basis from which I later did my book on cancer. So I had began to have 2 formative experiences that led to Commonweal. The one was going from an assistant professor at Yale to actually building a center for delinquent kids from the ground up with Carolyn Brown, which, again, it was completely clinically insane to give up a tenure track job at Yale to start a school for delinquent kids. It was a crazy professional move. But I had already jumped off the cliff before I started Commonweal. And I knew that we had been able to start this thing. We'd been able to find the funding. We'd been able to start this thing. So on that day in 75, when there in the back of my mind was the knowledge that I wasn't supposed to do this forever, but the other thing that was in the back of my mind was that the general principles of what I had learned from the work at Full Circle and looking at the role of nutrition in learning and behavior disorders of children, I had begun to generalize to a view that there was a broader lesson that the reason there were all these kids with learning and behavior disorders was not that all kids were born this way, but that there was an epidemic of this, and that this epidemic was related to a larger epidemic of chronic and degenerative illness, which was related to the environment. So at a conceptual level, it was clear to me that there was this picture emerging that the increased total environmental stress load on the biosphere and on human beings was causing an increase of casualty, specifically a casualty of learning and behavior disorders of children, but a broader casualty. And so this image that came to me walking on the mesa, this vision, was completely congruent with all of this, that I could imagine creating such a place, and I had that background. So that's the preface I promised, but I think it's useful. So I went back to the house where Leslie and I were living. We were living in Carolyn Brown's garage in a very makeshift place that we had cobbled together. And I told Carolyn, who I'd co-founded Full Circle with, of this vision. And she was standing in her kitchen drying dishes. She was a large Nordic woman with long brown hair, striking, very deep, profound eyes. And I told her the vision. She was drying a dish, and she looked at me and she said, well, why don't we try it? And so one of the things about me is that I've always done these things in partnership. And I could never have done any of them without very strong partners, of which you and Carolyn were the first. And so Carolyn suggested that we bring you into this. And so at that point, I want to turn to you and ask you how your backstory, how you got into this, and what you remember of the beginning.
This has been quite an exercise, trying to go back 40 years to these things that at the time I couldn't believe, forgetting any detail of it. And now there's a lot of haze, and I've made some discoveries reading the history that Mary's put together and talking, comparing notes with you. And you're, I think, having some better memories in some place than I may be in others. And But I don't remember really the actual first thing. But what I don't remember the people part of it. Mm-hmm. I remember, yes, the RCA property, which I was in love with as anybody who had walked on it back then, trespassed and walked would, and the magic forest, the twisted, contorted old Monterey pines that are died or slid off the slope now along the cliff edge. The old buildings, this building, but also the old hotel and the two cottages, which were really derelict buildings then, as many of you in this room will remember. But all of those things were attractive to me. I got some building and frustrated architect background. Was building my own house then, as many of us in Bolinas were in the 70s. And those old buildings just cried out to be loved and saved. Many of the ideas really resonated strongly with me, of these key things. The health ones. I came from a family that from when I was a very young age, a family that was very respectful of standard medicine in this country, but also very open to alternatives, and believed that both my father and I, who had various health problems, had benefited from non-standard medicine when I was 5, 6 years old, starting then, and my father as well in that period, in the starting in the late 1940s. My environmental roots, and I mean, for me, I'm coming that was very much part of the picture for me. And where I started at quite a young age, growing up on the Gulf Coast of Florida, really on the coast. I mean, the Gulf of Mexico was out the front door, and then there was a mangrove-lined lagoon out the back door. There was no television. There were really no other kids around with any distance that I could cover at a young age. A little more freedom when I could ride a bike on the main road. And part of what I saw there, I mean, one of my playgrounds was the Gulf of Mexico, but another one was these mangrove forests, which were magical. Mature mangrove forests that are just mysterious and tropical and could disappear in them, and full of wonderful wildlife. And while I was a kid still, much of the mangroves on the island we lived on were ripped out and converted to housing developments. And I knew even at a young age that there was something wrong with this. I mean, for one thing, they were taking away some of my playgrounds. And I knew from my parents that on a larger picture beyond me that this wasn't right. And I think that was really one thing that was very formative for me in keeping me on either on or returning to environmental work of one kind or another. And this would be an opportunity for a very positive, creative potential for working with this land and Commonweal's being steward of this land if we could acquire it. And also, it came at a time in my life. A little over a year before I'd left my first career as a journalist in broadcast news. I'd been working in San Francisco, and in the intervening year, I'd been. Well, first of all, why I left that is partly the state that broadcast news was getting into, which hasn't improved since, went downhill then and hasn't improved. Another was more personal, in that I found that journalism probably really wasn't right for me. I decided that I didn't want to write other people's stories. I wanted to be more involved myself in whatever the work was, work that was right for me, rather than telling about somebody else doing it. So it was wonderful timing in that regard. It was good timing also in that I was getting some very necessary training in the year between that would be helpful with Commonweal in the year between when I left broadcast news and when we started really working on this. I was working for the artist Christo and Jean-Claude. You may remember the Running Fence project they did in Marin and Sonoma counties. And for a wonderful year, I worked for them doing the environmental planning for it and the construction planning for building a 24-mile long, 18-foot high white nylon fence, which has some complications involved with it, including such things that would be vital for Commonweal, should it come to pass, of an enormously complicated permit process involving two counties, the Regional Coastal Commission, the State Coastal Commission, the State Lands Commission, on, an environmental impact statement that had to be done for it, and so on. I didn't realize at the time how useful that might be, but then I was politically active in Marin and active in environmental causes in Marin and so forth. And I think that's what Carolyn was seeing, those connections, and pretty connected with the Bolinas community and the utility district where I was a regular and very involved in the development of Bolinas community plan So all of those things were useful, and on the personal level, it was a wonderful time. And I think I remember a little skepticism about, well, why don't we get 1,200 acres on the California coast, an hour from San Francisco, and fix up those old buildings and do this cool project? But I think we share something of some confidence that if we certainly did then, that if we set out to do something, we could make it happen. Mm-hmm. I was thinking, I think I first heard from you probably the idea, well, if it's meant to happen, it will. I don't know how far back I heard that from you. I don't know if it was in that early. Yeah, I wasn't ready to. I think that would have been true for us then, but I think we were absolutely convinced it was meant to happen, and therefore we would make it happen. I've had some evolution in that, fortunately, in my relationship to work, which is of the level of ego involvement in it, which I think has been a wonderful process for me over the decades. But there we were, and I don't think it. I don't know if you remember, but I don't think it took me very long to sign on.
I don't think it did.
And you two were, of course, very convincing. I mean, if Michael and Carolyn were a great sales team, and with your vision of it, it was, and the raw material here, and its appeal for me, it was an easy choice.
I was just reflecting that as precious to anything else is to me in this whole process is that we've been friends throughout the 41 years that we've worked on and off together. And I think one of the things that really brought Commonweal into being was that it was from the very start a community. It was a group of us. It was not a single person.
Right.
And we could not have done it without any of the three of us. It's true I was the dreamer in the original vision, and Carolyn was the person that I couldn't do it without because she had some kind of, I couldn't have done Full Circle without her, I couldn't have done Commonweal without her. She gave me the confidence to do it. And it's very interesting for me that extraordinary women have played a critical role in almost every phase of my work who had the courage to partner to do these things. Carolyn Brown is one, Rachel Naomi Remen and the Cancer Help Program at a time later when my whole board thought it was insane and actually, jumping ahead, but this was when all our funding collapsed. I had to lay off everybody. This was 1982, and I'm out without a job, but holding on to Commonweal with 2 staff people left after the intervening period. And I meet Rachel, and I tell her about this vision of the Cancer Help Program, and she looks at me and says, why don't we do it, just the way Carolyn did? And I couldn't have done it without Rachel. So there's this theme in my life of partnerships with both men and women, but crucially for me in terms of courage with women, that I couldn't have done these things without them. And so Carolyn played that role for me of just the confidence. But you were the person who actually made it happen in terms of both, as you said, from the experience with Christo, we faced several big challenges. Number one, we had to get RCA to agree to sell us the place. Ultimately, we leased it. We can go on to that. Number two, we needed to get all the permits. Number three, we needed to get the Board of Supervisors to agree. Number four, we had to actually build the place once we had it. And you were the guy that made all that happen, you know, among many other things that you made happen. But you were the person who took this crazy vision that I had, and Carolyn had said, yeah, let's do it. And you joined us. And there were many pieces to that. One of them was that you correctly perceived, it seemed to me, that the community of Bolinas had a huge interest in this, because if RCA was going to sell this thing, and it became the southern entrance to the Point Reyes National Seashore with a great big physical plant, that was not exactly what the town of Bolinas had in mind in terms of tourist traffic and everything else. So it was protective of Bolinas, and it turned out to be a source of enormous employment of local people over a 40-year period.
I'll speak to the community part a little bit, but I want to take except you say it wouldn't have happened without me, and which is true, the person who made it happen. But I have to push back on that because you know, each of us. I mean, certainly at the beginning, it was such an equal thing. I mean, it would not have happened. You made it happen, really. You had the vision. You came up with the resources that allowed it to happen, which was an enormous challenge. And he did a huge amount of the outside support building of not just financial support, but the political support we need, and and making a lot of the program aspects of it happen.
That's true.
Most of it.
That's
really
true. That was my part.
I mean, it's that, and even that's oversimplifying it, because we worked across. There weren't
No, it was a true
right
partnership.
lines,
True
a lot
partnership.
of it.
Yeah.
But for the community stuff, and if, I don't know if we'll have discussion time after this, but some of you who were here then can add or amend what I would say about it, my memories of that time. It got around that we were talking. There was Michael and Carolyn and I were talking about trying to acquire the RCA property. And I think for a lot of people, there was real apprehension about that. Well, it's fine as it is, you know? I mean, let's just leave it the way it is. And we knew that RCA was phasing out and was going to be leaving and would be selling it. And there was skepticism about that. Well, are they really, or just denial about it as well. Eventually, and there's just this reluctance to accept change, which is so normal and certainly true in Bolinas, and certainly true in Bolinas in those years, that change is hard to accept. And then the prospect of it started to change to not these two guys buying it with some strange idea of creating a Commonweal, whatever that is, that it might become part of the National Seashore. Well, that was even more threatening to a lot of people, to have Point Reyes National Seashore come down to Poplar Road in Bolinas. I don't think that was welcomed by a whole lot of people in town. That also was going to happen. Eventually, it became clear that that was going to happen. And it also became clear that if Commonweal was going to happen, it was going to happen as part of that process, too. And there's a whole story and the political process of working with our Congressman, John Burton, who, I mean, that was another one of the, and we both had sort of lucky connections with various people that turned out to be very valuable in allowing Commonweal to happen. And I had history that went back with John Burton, our congressman, to the early 60s when I walked precincts for him in San Francisco when he first ran for the assembly. And later connections when I was on the AFL-CIO Central Labor Council in San Francisco and working with him and his brother, the Burton Machine, at political seasons then. And John and Phil were politicians of great political loyalty. That was bedrock in politics for them. So we had that going for us too. Not that he also was very sympathetic to Ed Wayburn, whom probably many of you know, who had a place in Bolinas for years and years and was head of the Sierra Club for a long time, and is working with Phil Burton, is responsible for adding millions and millions of acres to the national park system, especially the national parks in Alaska, but elsewhere too. The Golden Gate National Recreation Area. He and a partner started an organization that were the main spark plugs, working with Phil Burton to make that happen. And one of the things they wanted to do was for these Bolinas lands and some other lands to be added to the national seashore. And they weren't interested in seeing a Commonweal in these buildings. So there was a whole negotiation that had to happen with John and Ed, and we had help from John's chief of staff then, who was Barbara Boxer, and who went on to other things, the Board of Supervisors and the Senate. So and then there was the community plan, which had been approved, finished by the community, and adopted by the Board of Supervisors, which was very clear on a lot of things about not wanting Bolinas to become a tourist destination, that development here shouldn't attract, I mean, people will come to Bolinas if they can find it, but that we shouldn't be expected to provide facilities and take the impacts that would come with that, and many of which we're experiencing, which now, which are all of West Marin are experiencing, but nonetheless, these lands have remained a buffer between the highest impacts in the seashore and the community of Bolinas, which was certainly part of our intent then, and something that we promised the community it would be a function we would play here.
I want to circle back to some things you asked me to talk about and then continue this line. But you asked me to talk about the context of the time.
Yeah.
And so the context of the time, when Burr was an undergraduate at Yale, I was a graduate student at Yale. But the context of the time when I was working on the Harvard Crimson, which is where I spent most of my time at Harvard on the newspaper, and when I was a junior in '64, Kennedy was assassinated.
63.
What? 63. Okay, thank you. In '63, Kennedy was assassinated. And I was one of the principal people who covered the assassination for the Crimson. And, I went on, like you, in journalism to work for the Washington Post and the New York Times and various, the Washington Post city desk reporter and stuff. But like you, my journalistic training was fundamental to everything I've done since. It was what really taught me to write in some fundamental ways. And But there was the Kennedy assassination, and then there was the Martin Luther King assassination, and then the Bobby Kennedy, and there was the growth of the counterculture. I was literally teaching the course on the counterculture at Yale, and there was Vietnam, and there was the bombing of Cambodia, and there was just all this stuff was happening, and there was this revolutionary period of time. And Bolinas was the epicenter of where a lot of the hippies from the Summer of Love
Better
moved
place
out
to be. Bolinas in
Right.
the Bay Area,
Exactly.
California.
Exactly. It was the epicenter. So when Leslie and I got here in 72, and we walked into town, you couldn't believe what the street scene was in Bolinas, you know. And we had just come out from the day because we'd been looking for a place to live in San Francisco. We couldn't find one that would take our dog. And I walked into this little restaurant, Scowley's, and there was Orville Schell sitting at a table. Well, Orville was the older brother of Jonathan Schell, who I'd gone to Dalton School with and who later wrote The Fate of the Earth. And Orville was to become head of the School of Journalism at UC Berkeley and so forth. But at that point, he had, I think, recently written The Town That Fought to Save Itself. He was a close friend of yours.
Yeah, and it would have been, he was still working on that.
Oh, he was still working on it? Okay. Very close friend of Burr's. So, and I had known Orville in New York, so I sat down and we talked to him, and I began to, and the oil spill had happened in 71. And the history there was that the hippies who had moved out after the Summer of Love had been quiet, and then the oil spill happened, and they all came down to save the seabirds and organized. And then the town fathers decided they wanted to turn Bolinas into Carmel and pass this huge sewage plan. And the hippies didn't like that idea, so they coalesced. They recalled the water board, which was the center of power. They canceled the bond issue to build this huge, sewage system, and they took over the town. So that had happened just before we arrived. That was 71, something like that.
Yeah, November 71.
So we arrived in this town, which was not only filled with hippies and strange people, but it was also a place, in Orville's sense, the town that fought to save itself, that was actually transforming, And so the water board, which was the power center of this, was filled with people like Peter Warshall and, and Paul Kafetz and,
Rick Hewlett.
And so the time, I think, to understand Commonweal and all the other places that formed around that time, because it was by no means only, Jerry Jampolsky was out here yesterday, who started the Center for Attitudinal Healing in Tiburon, with his wife Diane, very extraordinary couple. And they started the Center for Attitudinal Healing at about that time. And, what Green's Restaurant started around that time.
Later, yeah.
So there was this whole set of institutions that started around that period of time, some of which survived, And so the context in which, I was saying to Burr before we started, I said, we're talking about starting Commonweal. I said, we were all clinically insane. And because it was insane to believe that 3 people could get a hold of 1,000 acres of land and these derelict buildings and create something like Commonwealth. It was crazy, but it was not crazy in the context of the time. It was a time when people believed that things were possible and where the question of what the world was going to look like was really up in the air. I mean, people did not know. There was such a transformation of consciousness. And I think what you and I and Carolyn brought to this is that we were sympathetic to the visionary ideas, but we were deeply practical people. And we had a piece of, a friend of mine once said that Michael is open-minded, but he's not so open-minded that his brains have fallen out, And there was that sense that, we were doing something that actually could be done based on your experience with Christo Fence, based on my experience and Carolyn's with Full Circle, based on the context of the time, it was actually plausible to sign up for it.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that context of those times too, and our generation then, and generalizations are dangerous, but there were a couple of generations of us then where there was, a large and prospering middle class, back when the middle class was prospering and growing, who kids didn't face the same. A lot of the kids didn't face the same pressures their parents did who'd come through the Great Depression and World War II, and we had greater freedoms, I think, to look around and not just be obsessed with, God, we got to get a job, and a bunch of us did spend a lot of time looking around and finding the things we wanted to be engaged in, and there was this great questioning of authority that really grew then, and with loss of confidence in government and large institutions to solve problems through the Vietnam War. I mean, your vision was in 1975. Saigon fell in April of 1975. Nixon resigned August of '74 after the Watergate nightmare. We grew up in the civil rights movement years, which was the first and certainly the largest social change movement in my lifetime, and there have been many in our lifetimes since then. But that context, I think, was very powerful for us to see, and many people, social activism and grassroots movements really took off then. And there were people who, anyway, that was very much the context, I think, of the time as well. And for us personally, I think, in terms of your saying that we were practical people, I think you and I are both serial social entrepreneurs.
Exactly.
And one thing that entrepreneurs need to be, social entrepreneurs, or in the for-profit world, is practical, or you don't got to have something more than dreams and perseverance. There has to be a strong streak of practicality that goes with it. And in some sense, this was a vision that was on the outer edge of practicality, and yet we were able to make it happen. It took some starts and stops. And
it did.
Yes, there were some bad years, which we're not going to get into today.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Serial social entrepreneurs does describe both of us. When I talk about Commonweal to this day, I say, the original vision was healing ourselves and healing the earth. But the alternative description, there were various descriptions, but the one I still use today is I say it's a think and do tank for social entrepreneurs. You think, you do, but we create a platform where gifted program directors who can raise their own money and have a vision of what they're going to do, and it's important, have a platform and a community in which to work. And Commonweal, really, we've never called attention to Commonweal itself. We let the work speak for itself. And there's a powerful Darwinian force at work, which if you can't raise the money, you can't do the project. And we're not going to raise the money for you, and that really has been a core part of how the place works.
Okay, if you can't raise the money, you had to find the venture capitalists, so to speak, who would be willing to take a chance on Commonweal. Certainly all the other parts were necessary, but goodness knows funding was necessary.
Yeah.
And that was a huge response. You had the main responsibility for that by far.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, Commonweal's got a budget north of $4 million a year now, and it's been running for 40 years. And we probably started with a budget of a couple of $100,000 the first year or so.
Oh, I think it was less than that.
So
I know what we were paying ourselves. And also, in those days, nonprofits could opt out of paying Social Security, nonprofit employees, and we did.
Yeah.
So we could buy groceries.
Well, I think, I mean, there are various answers to that, but I think if I step back from personally who I am, I think it helps to have, it's helped me to have some kind of quiet, charismatic energy, and I think that draws people, That's number one. The second thing I think it helps is I'm really interested in the truth. I'm not interested in spinning stories for people. I'm interested in, the truth. And the third thing is that I think people sense that it isn't an ego trip to me, that I am truly dedicated to using the skills that I've been given to create a better world, So there was the energy, there was a commitment to the truth, and there's a commitment to a better world. Then outside of that, I had a set of markings that worked in philanthropy, right? Dalton, Exeter, Harvard, Yale, taught at Yale, gave that up to start a school for troubled kids, then started Commonweal. The story had a certain sociological charm to it that was useful in talking to funders. So, but the specific early story was that, and I'd started with Full Circle, but that became the Commonweal story. So the first people I talked to were at the Babcock Foundation, Julia Bloomfield, who was the director of the Babcock Foundation. And she provided some of the first support for Full Circle. And then, and this is a very interesting story, McGeorge Bundy was the head of the Ford Foundation. Well, I grew up in New York, in the New York intelligentsia. My father was a political philosopher. My mother was a clinical psychologist, and they had parties. My mother threw great parties. And you could find McGeorge Bundy, Herman Kahn, who wrote Thinking About the Unthinkable about nuclear war. You could find Arthur Miller. You could find, just the artists, the playwrights, the political, Brzezinski would come. Rothko was there. That you could find these extraordinary, and I just grew up with them. I thought that was just how life was. And so I met Bundy. I remember meeting him, talking with Brzezinski, who became National Security Advisor, and Bundy, who became National Security Advisor, and Herman Kahn. I remember the three of them standing in front of my father's fireplace, their fireplace. So I met Bundy then, and then when I was at Harvard, and Bundy had become National Security Advisor and the Vietnam War was going on, Bundy agreed to debate a panel of students at Harvard about the Vietnam War, and I was one of the 3 or 4 panelists. And the others were from Students for a Democratic Society and something else. Well, they were fierce on Bundy, and I was very opposed to the Vietnam War, but I was polite. I was civil. And that's been true of me all my life, that I work with kindness, right? Civility at least, but kindness by preference. And so
Flash forward a few years, he's at the Ford Foundation.
And now he's at the Ford Foundation. So I write him a letter to Bundy, say, "Dear Mr. Bundy, you may not remember me, but I debated you at Harvard, and I, was teaching at Yale. I've come out here, and I met this little girl who was diagnosed retarded and turns out to be learning disability. And it seems like nutrition played a role. And we're starting this residential treatment center for neurologically handicapped kids to see what role nutrition plays in the learning and behavior disorders of kids, which was the report I found. Well, he sent out, he gets a ton of mail.
Yeah.
But his secretary rescued this from the pile and showed it to him. So he sent out this guy named Saul Chafkin, who was a senior program person for him, who ended up doing a huge project for Ford in New York on, urban development. And Saul Chafkin came out and he looked at it and decided I was okay. And what he said was, Michael's going to, quote, cruise the crazies. In other words, I was going to go look at all the crazy people who thought this was true. And he in turn sent out a guy named Talton Ray, who was the head of their program-related investment program.
Yeah.
So we ended up getting a grant from Ford Foundation to start Full Circle and a program-related investment loan to buy the property. And so when I started Commonweal, I went back to Bundy, and I think back to Talton Ray, though I don't. Did we get a program-related investment loan? I can't remember that.
Eventually.
Yeah, we may well have.
Yeah.
But in any case, by accident of birth and schooling, I had access. And by accident of biology, I inherited my father's sort of quietly charismatic energy. And those two forces together, along with a good project and a tendency to tell the truth, I think were key to developing what I never wanted to do, which was to be reasonably good at finding resources. There are people who are infinitely better than I am. I mean, you look at Paul Farmer, for example, who is a hero to many of us and who, raises hundreds of millions of dollars. But on a small scale, I had the skills to do this. Yeah. So that's a brief version of that. So let's go back we have much more to cover than we have time to cover, but I do want to insert in here, we reached an agreement with RCA to buy the property for $1.8 million we didn't have. And then, why don't you tell the next part of this? You got a call from Huey Johnson. Yeah, well, we're going to tell the story. Yeah.
Yeah, I was the world headquarters of Commonweal then in 1976 was my trailer on Horseshoe Hill where I was living while I was supposedly building my house. And the phone rings and I pick it up and it's Huey Johnson, who is the founder of Trust for Public Land and a hero of mine and to a lot of people. As perhaps the main person responsible for stopping the Marancello development in the Marin Headlands, which, if you don't remember it from living here in that period in the 60s, maybe you saw the documentary Rebels with a Cause that had a lot of showings around a couple of years ago. And so Huey had left the Nature Conservancy, started the Trust for Public Land, and told me he was calling here's my hero on the other end of the phone, whom I'd never met. And he said, I'm calling to let you know that you and Michael Lerner can forget about acquiring the RCA property and building that Boys Town out there or whatever it is you want to do. And I don't know how much. So that was the beginning.
Well,
that was my introduction to Huey.
Yeah. So I'll pick that up there. Let's just say this is what I think we both agree to say. We had a very interesting, sustained conversation with Huey about this. And
let me add one other aspect to it, that and he said he was going to acquire it. Trust for Public Land was going to acquire it and transfer it to the seashore, and that Ed Wayburn and Amy Meyer, the co-chairs of People for a Golden Gate National Recreation Area, had been in touch with him and sold him on the idea that Trust for Public Land should acquire these lands out here rather than those hippies in Bolinas. And this fit very well with TPL's business model of acquire lands, preferably at a bargain sale from RCA in this case, and then you sell it at market value to the national government. But that's
So we had a civil dialogue with Huey about this, and we were very fortunate that our attorney was Doug Ferguson, who was the chair of Huey's board for Trust for Public Land. So in the long run, after some back and forth, we ended up with a 50-year lease on the property, and it was transferred into the Point Reyes seashore. And so that's a very, and so it wouldn't have happened without Doug Ferguson either, had Doug not been our attorney. And it was, in a certain sense, Huey was a hero of mine too. I didn't know his work as well as you did by any extent. But I think what we can say is it prepared us for the fact that some of these things were going to be tough conversations.
Yeah.
You know, they weren't going to all be easy, but we were civil. You know, we were never impolite, and we had a point of view, and he had a point of view, and thanks to Doug Ferguson, we were able to reach agreement on it.
And we had to play real serious politics, too.
Right.
With John and Phil Burton, and make the most of our connections there, and which that was valuable. But also Ed and Amy had plenty of juice with Phil Burton as well. But John, this was in John's district, not Phil's district, and John also was very, I mean, Bolinas was a community that probably voted 75–80% for him in elections, and he was aware of the community's concerns about having a national park come up to its front door, side door. So he was concerned about that also.
I think you pushed back at me, but I do have to say that on the politics of this, you were absolutely overwhelmingly the lead. And it was John's trust in you, Barbara's trust in you, Gary Giacomini, when we needed to get the Board of Supervisors approval, their trust in you. I mean, you went on to be the head of the Point Reyes Bird Observatory, and then when you came back to Commonweal, did the ocean program and, you know, wrote the legislation that changed the laws on how California governs its ocean, lobbied it through the legislature, got Governor Wilson to sign it, got support from Packard to implement it. So your career, both inside and outside Commonweal, has been as a deeply trusted advocate for policies that make sense. And I worked much more in the field of mind-body health, juvenile justice, you know, that aspect of program. But your credibility and standing is what made Commonweal real. That has to be said. So you're a man who does not say too much about himself. So I have to say it from time to time. So let's go back now. We had this conversation. Then the two other things that happened that we have to say is that we needed to get the congressional approval for this, basically. So we tell a story of how we got the congressional approval for
Like the site visit?
What?
The site visit?
Well,
I think it was key, but
up to
actually, yeah, I mean, I think it's a good example of how things can fall out. I mean, the land was going to go into the seashore.
Right.
Phil told John I'm writing that land in. Phil Burton was responding to Ed and Amy, and John was fine with that, and he had to figure out how to make his constituents as happy as possible too. And Ed Wayburn and Amy Meyer are saying this shouldn't be a compatible use, Commonweal, in this part of the seashore. And we were saying, oh, we'd be great, and it'd be a plus for the community, and so on. And he did something he doesn't do very often. He asked Barbara Boxer, his chief of staff, to set up a site visit, and he'd come out, tromp around the land and invite Ed and Amy and Michael and me. And that's it, I think. There was the six of us, John and Barbara and Ed and Amy and Michael and I, walked around the land some, went over to the buildings, went up into the old hotel, which is Pacific House now, and climbed up. You could get to the third floor still then. And John was standing looking out the window at the Pacific waves rolling in. And Ed was standing on one side of him. I was standing on the other. And after a while, John turned to Ed and said, so, Ed, what do you think should happen to these buildings? And I don't think Ed had thought about that before then. And he sort of paused and said, well, it could be a visitor center for the southern entrance to the seashore. And John just sort of turned, looked back out the window, and went, and I had this feeling that it was decided right then that Commonweal would get written into the deal, and which is how it came down.
So we got this. What was it called? Written into the congressional.
Committee report of Phil's chairman of the House Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs. That's where he authored the bill. That it was an omnibus. I forget what the name of that bill was. There was so much pork in that bill. This is how Phil Burton, after losing a campaign to be Speaker of the House, how he built his power was in creating park bills, particularly this one, that had something in it for I don't know how many congressmen, how many congressional districts. And one of the national parks in it was the Point Reyes National Seashore that included these additions, the Bolinas lands and the RCA lands in the northern end on the Point Reyes Peninsula. And in the committee report, was very strong on continuing agriculture on these lands and really encouraging, the Park Service to use the maximum tools they could for keeping long-term agriculture on it, and said that Commonweal would be included with its long-term lease that we already had with Trust for Public Land, that would carry over into the seashore.
So once we had the congressional approval, we needed the Marin Board of Supervisors to sign off on this. Did we also need Coastal Commission?
First the county and then the Coastal Commission. Yeah.
Right. So I have a memory that you don't remember because we talked about it, but my memory is actually very clear that we first had to go to the Planning Commission. And the Planning Commission, in my clear memory, if anybody ever looks it up, we can find out, unanimously rejected Commonweal.
I hope not unanimous.
It was their report.
Not my friend Gloria Duncan.
Okay, all right. Well, they rejected Commonweal. So we had to go to the Board of Supervisors and overcome a negative recommendation. And Gary Giacomini was our supervisor. And so we showed up in force at that supervisor's hearing. I remember Billy Cambier and Avis Rappaport, who we brought down from Covelo to start the Commonweal Garden. Avis's mother was an outstanding Marin citizen.
Ruth Solomon was
yeah.
a stalwart in the environmental community.
Right,
Very
and
active.
I remember her getting up and testifying at the, when there was time for, anyway, we packed the room, and since it was Gary's district, we had a unanimous supervisor reversal of the Planning Commission thing and permission to go forward. So I don't remember the Coastal Commission thing. What was that like?
It's strange that I tend to remember the bumps in the road, and why I don't remember that one, I don't know. But I remember that the tension around the Coastal Commission, which was the Coastal Act. Well, let's see. The Coastal Initiative was in 1972, and that sunset in 5 years. And then, so there was a big statewide planning involvement up and down the coast. It took legislation to continue what was ending after 5 years with the initiative, and that was in 1976. So that legislation was passed, good, strong, the strongest coastal protection legislation in the country, which is why Northern and Central California coasts look the way they do instead of Southern California. And Jerry Brown, in his first time around, signed that into law. So this was a year or two old when we were going, and it was all new, really. The procedures and whatnot, or aspects of it were new, that we were going to them. And they had a lot of tough requirements, and we were asking for a lot here. And so that ended up going very smoothly. But there was a fair amount of care that had to go into that process.
And again, that was all you.
And fortunately, I had a lot of history with them, including not just with running fence, but that was really, really valuable, the experience of how to do it and what's involved, but also just the connections. I mean, I wasn't a stranger coming in the door.
So late 75, I think, you and I are out on the land now. We've been through this history, right? We had the vision. We tried to buy it from RCA. We reached agreement.
It has to be later. I mean, 75 was your vision. So
okay, it was
77, late 77?
Really?
I guess,
okay.
Yeah.
Well, except our incorporation papers are 76.
But we weren't on the land yet.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah, or we wouldn't have been using, I think, my trailer as
Okay. Well, these are things to be discovered.
Right.
Right.
That's right.
In any case, you think it's 77 we're on the land.
On the land, yeah.
All right. So here we are.
Wait a minute. Are we going to pass over
What?
the September 76 memo?
Oh, no. Let's talk about the September 76 memo. You talk about it, because I wrote it to you.
Yeah. You don't want to start?
I think, well, let me start by saying this. We came down to a vision that Commonweal would have a clinic, a research institute, a residential center, and a farm. Those were the four core things. And we took the first, before we were going to call it, early on, I want to remember it, Carolyn and I, before it became Commonweal, we were going to call it the Institute for Planetary Services. That will give you an idea of what it was like. So I remember Carolyn and I went to Judge Mary Conway Kohler, who was the first juvenile court judge in the state of New York, and was a close friend of Ruth Chance at the Rosenberg Foundation. And Ruth was one of the earliest supporters of Commonweal, and also a Full Circle.
She said, lose that name.
She said, she looked at us and said, now, dears, that won't do. So I was, after that, I was sitting in my living room. I can date this because it was around my son's birth, after my wife Leslie and I had gotten married. So it was 75. And I was trying to think of a name. And Leslie said, what about Commonweal? Common, W-H-E-E-L. And I thought, that's nice. And then I thought, not Commonweal, but Commonweal. So we had a name that would pass muster. It turned out to be a very good name because it means the well-being of the community, which is what Commonweal is all about. So, so the memo was...
we weren't on the site.
We weren't on the site yet.
But we must have been, we'd gotten the deal agreed with Huey and TPL.
Right,
That
and
was settled.
we were still, there were actually two memos in my memory. One memo was the memo where I talked about, okay, we can do Commonweal even if we don't get the land.
That's in this memo too.
That's in this memo,
Yeah,
right.
Also. And you were saying we're 80%
80%
sure
likely to get it.
likely to get
Yeah.
it if, you know,
Right,
Huey's agreed to it.
Yeah.
We don't have the lease
Right.
signed yet and that sort of thing.
you go on from
that's
there.
where we were.
Yeah,
And this was, I don't know, it was just a 16-page memo or something
yeah,
like that.
yeah.
Going into incredible detail on some things, very sketchy details on some, great detail on making the clinic happen,
Right,
and timetables and you know, down to not quite down to what furniture is needed for the
Right.
clinic. I'm not down to that level, but just a cut above that level of detail, and it was and also, but starting off saying, and if we don't get the land, we can do all of this stuff someplace else anyway. So we'll plan as though we're getting it online, but at the same time, we'll be ready to put it someplace else if we don't get the land. and the opening date for the clinic will be March 1st. This is written sometime in September. And we'll hire a medical director in by December.
Right.
And sort of like you get the picture. And I don't know if we had if Susan Dunn had joined us by then or not.
I think Susan joined us when we were on the land.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Susan, who subsequently died, was a wonderful really critical early person, and who played a key role, Burr reminded me, in something was fundamental to Commonweal, which we became the largest comprehensive employment training act employer in West Marin. We had something like 40 slots, which we filled with the people who renovated this building and did a tremendous amount of the work on the site.
There's a federal job creation program called CETA, Comprehensive Employment and Training Act. And
Karen, were you part of that hiring? Do you remember? Karen Willig? Yeah.
I think early 80s.
Yeah. Right.
And Susan Dunn figured this thing out. I mean, Susan had no background in any of this stuff either.
Right.
Figured out how to work that system, and we hired.
I think it was 40 slots.
Yeah, and I think may have been a CETA program also that in the summer before, where we hired Blues High School kids who helped clean out. This whole floor and that whole floor above,
which were filled with
58 feet by 58 feet, was crammed with electrical equipment.
So we cleaned it out, and then Burr, with the architect Steve Mattson, designed the clinic, which is the way the place is set up now, on the ground floor, and Burr supervised the construction using all these CETA people.
Yeah, this whole floor was just an empty room at that point with those columns in it.
Yeah. And that lasted about how long? I think it lasted 5 years or something.
Quite a while. I think beyond when I left in 1980. But and so I don't. What I don't have. I mean, I uncovered that memo a few years ago and read it and had a good laugh. And I mean, I think it had to have been clear to me at the time we probably weren't going to open the clinic on March 1st, and some of those other things. But something, looking back, I realized that it was always important for you to have a plan and a concrete plan. It may be a different plan next week. If realities come up, if realities come up that make it necessary to change the plan, Michael would change the plan, but would be the next version of that plan, and then there'd be inevitably another one after that because other factors would come up as well. But that's the way
that's how I work.
Yeah.
I like to give people a sense that I know what I'm doing. And so, and it isn't an artificial sense but I'm not attached to my plan. So what I do, and I do it to this day, I put out a plan, and then I say, in effect, does anybody have a better idea? And if somebody has a better idea, terrific. But the point is, there's something to people to respond to,
right.
And there's an image or a vision of how we best thinking at this time. When Susan Braun was the executive director here for 4 years, a world-class nonprofit CEO, and when Susan was here, she and I deeply agreed, this was, only 5 years ago or so, that we didn't believe in a strategic plan, but we believed in strategic planning as an ongoing process. People put all this work into strategic plans, and then typically they sit on the shelf. But if you have a strategic planning process, which is a continuing process, which is what Susan and I did and what Oren and I do now with Arlene Alsman and Vanessa McCott, then there's a constant revisiting of where you think you're going strategically. So, I do have that need to think out in considerable detail where I think we're going. And then you're absolutely right that it changes on an ongoing, continuing basis with no assumption that it should be otherwise,
So this plan, though, so we've been working together on the vision and getting land. Right. Now we're working together for the first time on the ground.
Yeah, right.
On the ground. So this reads like, this is what we're going to do. So, over time, I think and then Susan and I came to understand of how this process has to be, of feeling free to read these plans and say, well, that ain't going to happen, and not on that timeline, and go talk, hey, Michael, let's talk about this. I think, this may be possible if we do it that way or whatever. And we were under tremendous pressure to get stuff done. So we've got something to show. You really felt that pressure. Funders wanting to see results, of course, and we all wanted to see results. We'd been working away at this for a couple of years or 3 years or whatever already, and so it was wanted to get things to come together as quickly as possible. But that was an interesting method of a way we found to work together on that. Sort of, we'd feel pretty free to edit the plans.
Of course. So moving on past CETA and the clean out of the buildings and the construction of the clinic and all that, Another key early participant in this was my brother Steve Lerner, who was the director of the Research Institute and had worked with me at Full Circle before that. And Steve came on early, and with CETA staff, we created this research institute and began publishing Common Knowledge, which was like a magazine, a newspaper magazine, on I think a quarterly basis, and had some extraordinary people working with Steve, some of whom are still with us today and in the community. We also did hire a medical director early on, Brian Bausch, and started the clinic. So we started the clinic, we started the Research Institute.
So here's an example of plans changing.
Right. Yeah.
So that the September 76 memo, the famous September 76 memo, talks about the clinic's going to open in 5 months. And that was the alternative clinic out.
Right.
What do we call it? Not alternative, it was the...
that was the clinic out here.
Out here.
Which was going to continue the work that we had started at Full Circle with kids with learning and behavior disorders, but also work with adults with chronic environmentally related problems.
Yeah. Well, there was no mention in the September 76 memo of a community family health practice in downtown Bolinas for the community of Bolinas. But a year from then, roughly, we opened the clinic downtown, first in what was the Sharon building then, and half of that space, and then later moved it to the College of Marin Marine Lab, which we leased from the College of Marin, the Marin Community College District. And the clinic out here still hadn't opened yet, actually. So there was a lot of improvisation.
A lot.
As we went along. Remind me how the decision was made to do the downtown. And this was before Coastal Health Alliance, of course.
And let me say something else about this, which is that when I started Full Circle with Carolyn, and then when I started Commonweal, I knew very little about nonprofit management. So in retrospect, it was a quite chaotic period of time in many respects, but it would have been less chaotic if I had been a seasoned nonprofit director. So I just know that and completely accept that. That's who I was. But so how the community clinic started was that the physician who'd been working in town running a little clinic out of that building, he left. And so the community was without anybody to do this stuff. And we had hired Brian Bausch. And so we had a medical director. This is my memory of how it worked. We met Steve Rosenberg, who was a very experienced guy in terms of creating community clinics. So
he knew the bureaucracy.
He knew the bureaucracy, he knew it. So Stephen got us, I think he may have gotten us permission both for this clinic and the downtown clinic.
Again, Susan Dunn working.
And Susan Dunn worked with Stephen Rosenberg. So we ran the community clinic because we had the ability to do so. We were working on this clinic, and it seemed like the right thing to do for the community. But Brian Bausch was the first medical director. Again, what's fascinating is how many of these people remain friends and on good terms with us. That relatively few people have left Commonweal unhappy. A few have, but not a lot. And after Brian Bausch was the medical director, Charlie Thompson came as medical director with his girlfriend and I think later wife, Susie. And so both Brian and Charlie were first-rate integrative medicine practitioners. So again, from the start, and this has been pretty characteristic of Commonweal, it may be improvisational, but we're working with extraordinarily gifted people from the start in almost any part of Commonweal that you look at. And also, it was very flat from the start, that if somebody was the medical director or the director of the research institute or whatever they were, they had tremendous latitude to do what they thought was right. And there was a strong bond of trust and a real commitment to hiring extremely qualified people. And there was another thing I liked about it was we were never a spiritual community. We were never an intentional community. We were a place to do good work. We were a place to do good work. You could believe whatever you wanted. You could have whatever perspective you wanted. If you were extraordinarily good at what you did and able to handle what you showed you could handle, we welcomed you. And we had this commitment to being at least civil and preferably kind with each other, which created a sense of community that made people want to stay. So we ended up with staff people who have been here 20 to 30 years sometimes. So that, to me, because I believe, to go out of this context, that love is the most important dimension of healing and of how the universe works. And kindness is the step down from love into, we all can think whatever we think about what love is, but we know what kindness is. And so kindness became part of the deep fabric of this place from early on, which created the sense of community. And the community had the resilience and the strength to make something impossible happen. Yeah. So where should we go from there?
You were headed into the research, and so did you do the research?
No, that's enough, because I'm going to talk to Steve about the Research
Yeah.
Institute. Yeah.
Where should we go from there?
Well, talk a little about I think what would be good to talk about would be the major projects that you have been involved at Commonweal, not only in this first period, but I'd also love you to talk about the ocean program. But at the beginning, one of the major projects was the offshore oil drilling issue.
Right. And that goes back to the Research Institute, because Steve Lerner's interests were wide-ranging, and he would dig into wonderful topics, some of them fairly local, like the Farallon nuclear dump, and some of them, global environmental concerns, and another one was electromagnetic
Radiation.
Pollution and radiation and health effects. That gives you some idea of the breadth. Well, one of the things that he got turned on to was that coming up was going to be a federal Bureau of Land Management sale of leases for development of offshore oil and gas in 5 basins off the northern and central California coast. One of those basins being off San Mateo County and another one being off Sonoma County, just upwind from the Point Reyes National Seashore, plus 3 other areas where leases would be put up for sale. And it wasn't on anybody's radar screen in northern and central California. There was some old offshore oil development in Southern California, as you probably know, that you can see those platforms offshore in Santa Barbara and so on. And people really didn't see it coming. The environmental community certainly was not tuned into it. And the first thing a lot of people heard was in Common Knowledge, an article that Steve wrote about it there. And Steve argued that Commonweal should get involved in this and take this up seriously, because so few people were. I mean, this should have our name on it. And the three of us talked about it, and I was arguing that we shouldn't, that we had plenty to focus on. I also realized that if we got involved in it, it would probably be me, not Steve. That was clear that it wasn't going to be Steve. There wasn't going to be you. Let's see, who did that leave? And I thought my plate was pretty full already with the other things around here. But I was outvoted on that and took it on. And so that was my first program involvement with Commonweal, as opposed to on the other side of the line, and really became deeply involved over the next, let's see, that would have been in early 78, much of 78 and 79, until I left at the end of 79 to go to Point Reyes Bird Observatory. I'm working with a handful of other people in northern and central California, and Gary Giacomini and coastal supervisors up and down the coast started organizing to resist that lease sale that was going to be coming up, lease sale 53, and that became fortunately, a lot of other people eventually joined in, or some key people joined in. And that became a very, very successful environmental fight that people who took over after I moved on from that, people like Warner Chabot particularly, and not here at Commonweal, and Richard Charter in Sonoma County, took that to Washington, turned it into a very successful campaign, won the congressional moratorium on offshore oil development on this coast that has been renewed since then, and turned it into a political issue that no one was paying attention to since then. It's been a litmus test for statewide candidates, certainly since then, of both parties. Candidates for governor at some point need to go to Monterey, stand on the beach with a camera and the ocean behind them, and say they're pledged to no offshore drilling off here, northern and central California. But that's where that one went. And Steve was right. We should get involved. Should have gotten involved with that.
And it's a fascinating first example of a whole set of initiatives over 40 years that have had tremendous impact. I mean, I won't get them all, but the oil one is one. The pioneering work on the role of nutrition in the learning and behavior disorders of children is a second. Obviously, the Cancer Help Program and the Bill Moyers film about it and its critical role in legitimizing the field of mind-body health is a third.
Jay.
The launch of a whole set of environmental health programs, including Healthcare Without Harm, the International POPs Elimination Network, the Keep Antibiotics Working Network, just a whole series of environmental health initiatives, the Juvenile Justice Program. Commonweal has been a seedbed for a whole set, starting with this one, which you were the principal author of, a seedbed for a whole set of very effective projects. And this was the first. This was the first.
Yeah, I guess it was. Yeah.
You went to PRBO in Point Reyes Bird Observatory to direct that in 79.
Beginning of 80. Yeah.
Beginning of 80.
Circle the end of
and you came back in 1997 to direct the Oceans Program, which went through 2012. I mentioned briefly my version of what you did in the Oceans Program, but could you say that with more clarity and authority than I did?
Well, I'll be authoritative about
Yeah.
it. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. How to keep this brief. I didn't know we were going into that territory, but the genesis of that was after I related to an effort to reform the way California manages marine life and fisheries, which has been quite poor. And after I left here, at PRBO, there were issues that I was very involved in, not only being executive director, but involved on the program side, doing the conservation work that PRBO did. And one of the main ones was, some of you will remember the problems with gill netting fisheries along the California coast, and that developed rapidly after the Vietnam War. There were a lot of Vietnamese refugee fishermen, and that's who were using huge, long monofilament gill nets that were killing tens of thousands of seabirds and lots of, sea otters, marine mammals, and so on. And that sort of had PRBO's name on it. Part of it, the seabirds dying in that fishery were birds that nest on the Farallon Islands, which PRBO managed for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we had the data on this stuff. It was obviously our responsibility to be involved in that issue. And so I worked a lot with the Department of Fish and Game and the Fish and Game Commission and the environmental community and eventually the legislature, because under the system then, only the legislature managed commercial fisheries, not the Department of Fish and Game. Odd, but true. So you had 40 or whatever assembly people managing fisheries in the state. And so I learned a lot about the dysfunctionality of how the state managed fisheries. Then, sometime after I left that, I worked for the Center for Marine Conservation, which is now the Ocean Conservancy. And it was just getting involved in federal fishery management. And so I got involved in that and was appointed as the first environmental representative on one of their main bodies of the Pacific Fishery Management Council, the four-state body that manages fisheries in California, Oregon, Washington, and regard to salmon, Idaho also. And spent 4 years sitting around tables with commercial fishermen and sport fishermen and learning a whole lot about the dysfunctionality of federal fisheries management. And I didn't want to have anything to do with either state or federal fisheries management after that. But in 1996, some really good people were elected to the California Assembly, including a wonderful guy named Fred Keeley from Santa Cruz. And a number of these new assemblymen wanted to do something for the coast for reasons which I won't go into, but similar to the situation we just had recently with the head of the Coastal Commission being fired. There was a similar incident then. That effort lost, and as a result, there were a number of Democratic pro-coast assemblymen elected. So Fred Keeley wanted to do something for it, and he decided that reforming fishery management would be it. And a number of people said, well, you got to talk to Burr Heneman. I had this odd, in the environmental community, I had this odd history of experience with both federal fishery management and state fishery management, really on the inside of it, that nobody else had. So it seemed that I needed to take that on it. But here was this blank slate to be able to work with. Fred would say, what should we do? Let's do the reforms that it takes. So that was a wonderful opportunity, and ended up with over a 2-year process negotiating for Fred a large reform package for how the state manages fisheries, which was passed, and that was the last bill that Pete Wilson signed into law as governor. And then what followed that, though, I mean, that was the easy part. The hard part was the states implementing that stuff, and that's where I put together an ambitious program to help the state agencies doing it, and with their blessing, they wanted the help. So, which has been kind of my style in how I've tended to work. I've done advocacy work some, but I'm most comfortable working more on the inside, like helping agencies do their jobs better, writing legislation that fixes problems in natural resource management, that sort of thing. So this was a several-year program, bringing in scientists, bringing in policy people to work with the state agencies and put this ambitious reform legislation into effect, and that and then that morphed into various other things as well. There was the something quite off the wall was ended up somehow causing to be appropriated $40 million for a coastal observing system that has land-based radar that bounces signals off waves. Oh, physical oceanographers love this. Well, I'd never worked with physical oceanographers before, a lot of marine biologists and ornithologists and whatnot. So this was fun for me. I got to work with physical oceanographers a lot, which is a whole different world, because the agency that we directed the money to didn't have any experience with it either. It says, you got us into this. You got to help us implement this. So it was working with scientists from Scripps and Jet Propulsion Institute and all the various UC campuses that have marine programs. And it's this really interesting technology for imaging what's coastal currents, which are much more complex than than oceanographers realized. And one of the transmitter receiver stations is actually on the Commonweal property out on the cliff, and another one at Point Reyes, and so on. So that was sort of an oddball diversion for me that was fun. I got to learn about some other stuff. And then, but even before I'm really sort of a seabird person, and became that even more so. My love of seabirds goes way, way back to childhood, and I was able to indulge that a fair amount when I was at Point Reyes Bird Observatory, especially given our responsibility for the Farallones and the time I got to spend out there. Even going back, I first started going to the Farallones in 1971, and had done a lot of work with seabird conservation. And in 2006, the Packard Foundation board, some of the family members decided they wanted to develop a global marine bird conservation program, and they asked me and an old friend and colleague if we'd be interested in designing it for them. And yes. So designed a program for them for shorebirds. He specialized in the shorebirds, I specialized in the marine birds, and then they asked me to stay around. He had another job, and they asked me to stay around and manage the initial years of that, doing the granting and so on, which was a wonderful experience and took me to wonderful seabird places in the world, and meeting terrific seabird conservation folks who are doing great practical projects and so on.
I want to open it up. Any comments or questions that any of you would like to make? Yes, Karen.
Way back in the 70s, early 80s, there was a Dr. Michael Rosenbaum here, and there seemed to be a model of medicine. People would come in for allergy testing foods were eliminated, the vitamins were encouraged. Has that part of the medicine been phased out or eliminated?
Well, it's a great question, Karen, and thank you for being part of the staff in the early years. Yes, Michael Rosenbaum, Brian Bausch, Charlie Thompson, they all worked in the clinic here. All of them went on. Michael Rosenbaum had a long career in Marin as a holistic physician. Brian Bausch we're still very much in touch with Brian, who has a specialty, among other things, in cancer and is a leading integrative medicine physician in northern in Petaluma and so on. That approach, we've remained deeply interested in what was first called holistic medicine and then called integrative medicine and now sometimes called functional medicine, although integrative and functional are two different themes in contemporary medicine. And through the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, which is our partnership of 5,000 people around the world thinking about how the environment affects human health, we explicitly make the link between what we call the ecological paradigm of health, which goes back to the original description of Commonweal as a center for service and research in health and human ecology, which has remained amazingly accurate, although we don't call it that now, but as a center for service and research in health and human ecology. And what we keep rediscovering is that given the complexity with which the environment affects human health, that one of the smartest ways to sustain or recover health is with an equally complex and integrative holistic response. In other words, that mainstream medicine does a very important thing with these laser-like targeted treatments. But if you have cancer or heart disease or diabetes or memory loss or whatever it is, what really works best is an integrative approach that characteristically involves diet, exercise, stress reduction, and finding meaning or support in your life. And those four things are at the heart of Dean Ornish's reversal program for coronary artery disease and prostate cancer, and they're at the heart of functional medicine, the work of Mark Hyman and Jeff Bland and many others. We've done a lot in functional medicine. They deeply relate to food allergies and chemical sensitivities. And so all of the early work that we did in the clinic continues. What happened was that when CETA completed its funding in 1982 or so, and the San Francisco Foundation stopped funding us in a major way, we lost our two major sources of support. We had to lay off virtually the whole staff. And when we rebuilt Commonweal, it was on a new model that instead of having institutional frameworks like a clinic that you'd have to fund forever, we decided that we would be a flexible instrument of human service and that we would do projects and programs, but each one would have to pay for itself. And when the funding ran out, that program would end, and we would look for new people with the vision to do something new that was creative and worthwhile. Other comments or questions? Yeah, Tina.
I noticed I'm captured by the fact that you have a 50-year lease and it's the 40th anniversary. And there's certainly been much discussion, if not controversy, about leases in the seashore.
Thank you for that question. And we naturally are paying attention to that question. I think two things to say. Oren Schlossberg and Jennifer Altman organized a wonderful dinner that we held recently in Pacific House, celebrating the 100th anniversary of the National Park Service and the 40th anniversary of Commonweal and the Seashore. Cicely Muldoon, who's the superintendent of the Point Reyes Seashore, was there with a number of her senior staff. And what we did was to celebrate a 40-year partnership that has really worked extremely well for both Commonweal and the Seashore. So there's a deep sense of mutually respectful partnership for us. And again, you're right that there are controversies about the ranch leases, although the Park Service favors them, but others do not. And there are controversies about the oyster farm and so on and so forth. Again, our mode has been to work with mutual respect and kindness and a real desire to get it right, because we deeply believe that the National Park Service is a gem. It is an amazing gift to the American people. And while we wanted to own the land, we are honored to be partners in the Point Reyes Seashore. Now, will we be able to continue the lease? The Park Service would certainly like us to, but what we will face is the challenge that when a new lease is written, they will have to reevaluate the land according to current land values, and there's a formula for how the rent will be, and we're going to have to figure that out. My point of view about it is twofold. One is that, or threefold. One is, it goes back to the beginning. If this is meant to be, if it is meant to continue, if we continue 10 years from now to be, or 15 years from doing first-rate work, I think we'll find a way. That's the first one. The second one is, if we can't do it here, Commonweal is a movable feast, and we will find another place to continue the work. And the third one is, if we can't do it here and we can't move it, then we should just celebrate 50 years of extraordinary work, because ultimately an organizational form is not what matters. We're part of an endlessly abundant, regenerative community of human beings who decide to devote their lives to service. And that continues with different organizational forms over time. So Jerry John Polsky has a lovely line in his work at the Center for Attitudinal Healing. He wrote a book by this title called Love is Letting Go of Fear. And so if we enable ourselves to be fearful about the future, we lose the opportunity to do the best work we can do right now. And continuing to do the best work we can do right now is by far the greatest guarantee that the work will continue in some form.
It's certainly helpful to me to hear that the Seashore appreciates it.
They do
Very much
appreciate
so,
it,
yeah.
deeply so.
I did not know that. I'm glad
Yeah,
to hear
thank you, Dina. Other comments, questions, reflections? Well, yes, Elia.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you, and all of you who have done this work over the years. Just from all of us, thank you.
Burr, I wanted to ask you for any last reflections of yours. What's it been like for you to be part of this enterprise and so central to it?
I mean, it feels like home to me.
Yeah.
It felt like home at the beginning, and when I came back,
Yeah.
it felt like home. And when I'm on the fringe now of Commonweal, and it feels like home.
Well, I cannot ever thank you enough for 40 years of partnership and the work, and I'm very glad that you were willing to have this conversation. All right.
A treat.
All right. Thank you all for coming.